Good afternoon and a very hearty welcome on behalf of the SIOS to the panelists as well as to the larger audience. We have invited a few people from the society as well as from outside. So let me extend a warm welcome to all of you at this discussion. I won't call it a webinar or anything. The idea of holding this was to have a little brainstorming after the um, important Quad summit, which was held only on 24th. And needless to say that last few days saw intense and very hectic diplomatic activity in various parts of the world, especially in the United States, which Prime Minister Modi visited. He had bilaterals with President Biden as well as Prime Minister Morrison and Prime Minister Suga. Then he had the Quad summit there with four members of the Quad. And then later on, he addressed the United Nations General Assembly. So we have seen Quad 2.0, I think, emerging. The last meeting was in March. It was a virtual meeting. That too also was very important because it was soon after President Biden had taken over, and whether he would give a continued push to this Quad idea, which had actually started taking shape in President Trump's time. 217, I think it really started evolving after having actually born in 2004. So this 2.0, I think it signifies, and this meeting itself, in my view, um, I think a kind of a beginning of a new contour of foreign policy of many countries. Certainly these four countries, but also it has implications to other countries as well. In what way it is different? I think it has given a signal to China, and although the word China has not been mentioned at all in the bilateral discussions between the leaders, the Quad summit, nor the Quad statement which came out mentions China directly. But I think the signal was, um, you know, impeccably clear because what I think Quad countries are actually done or trying to do is to challenge the kind of order which China has been propagating or talking about, and in fact trying to push its way through its expansionist policy, it is very unilateral actions and so on. And that I think has been questioned and questioned by democracies, which are not known to be, so efficient or moving fast or always not in a coordinated manner. So I think that is something in term. It may not be showing tangible results in just one summit, but I think this is the direction Quad seems to be evolving. At the March meeting, they had decided to have three working groups, three areas, three C's as they called COVID, critical technologies, and climate change. I think they had focused on three very important and contemporary urgent areas. And in that, I think some progress is taking place, um, particularly in the COVID area. The idea that there should be production of 1 billion doses and that they should be in the year from next year onward should be distributed to developing countries. Uh, India has been also given the facility to produce, and I think some finance has been offered by other two Quad members to produce biological E, that the J&J vaccine. So I think this India's strength has been well recognized in this COVID context also. I think in the critical technology area, to my mind, there is a definite gain for a country like India. Again, these are all early days. But in fields like semiconductors, which has been identified now at this Quad Summit, semiconductor was focused. So this is one area, as we all know, India has very badly lagged behind. So semiconductor is another area. Then telecom, I think using that OPAN for 5G, that will be a gain for us. Also, I think what they call liquid hydrogen. So some of these areas will be of considerable importance. Is critical in critical technologies. And finally, climate change. I think this is a challenge which all of us face, and India has, I think, so far recorded reasonably good progress in this regard. Um, we have been told that although our target is net zero by 2050, which is in fact putting a lot of pressure on us, but they will also take into account these national circumstances. So perhaps we have been given some leeway in this regard as well. So this is, I think, in terms of benefit what we get, and I think the most importantly, India could now aspire to get into some of the GVCs, the global value chains, because of the economic integration which may emerge as a result of the this induction of these technologies and so on. Another development which took place almost simultaneously was the announcement by the US and Australia, UK of the AUKUS, Australia, UK, US. Now, this is a development which is looked upon differently by different countries. There is an argument that AUKUS would dilute the import of Quad. On the other hand, there are people who are saying that AUKUS, in which Australia will get nuclear-powered submarines from the US, that will automatically strengthen Quad. But it looks like whether it strengthens or dilutes, that I think we can see is debatable, and there are still many years to pass before the nuclear-powered submarines will be with the Australians. I think coalitions of this nature, three countries coming together for very specific benefits, could be a new trend in the foreign policies of the countries. We haven't had that kind of experience before. So in many ways, I think countries like, even including India, are going to learn new things in their foreign policy operations. And whether Quad really signifies or not, we can see. Well, I've spoken at length. Actually, I would like to hear three of our experts who have very kindly agreed to spare their time and join us and give their perspectives on Quad. And we have three very distinctive and distinguished representatives. Admiral Anup Singh, who is also the Director of Strategic Affairs in the SIOS, and who we all know is a great veteran from the Navy, who had commanded the Eastern Fleet of India. And needless to say, I think the navies will be playing a very important role in Quad. In fact, the pivot, so to speak, is now going to be the oceans, maritime security, and so on. So I think his perspective will be really very valuable. We have Professor Swaran Singh, who is internationally well-known China expert, and he is here with us. I'm sure all of you have often seen him on television and other social media channels, giving his analysis of the developments in China. He's there. Ambassador Biren Nanda, my old friend and colleague, he has served in Indonesia as ambassador and high commissioner in Australia. I think when we talk of Indo-Pacific, there can't be more appropriate person to speak on this subject than Biren. He is also an old China hand. So he brings the total perspective of that region. I'm also very happy I see Ambassador Kiran Doshi in the audience, my very old colleague, golf partner, and very distinguished ambassador and author who takes keen interest on these subjects. He is also here. Then Dr. Vinesh Gautam is also joining us today. And of course, thanks to Professor Krishnendra Meena, we have all these arrangements, our Secretary General of the SIOS. So without further ado, may I invite Anupji to please give your views on this subject.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think, first of all, it must be said that the Quad cooperation framework is really making a robust transition from a loose-knit and one could say a non-influential body towards an effective multilateral mechanism. For sure, the first ever in-person summit has opened a new avenue for the overall and, in fact, renewal of the Quad. It is important to underscore the fact that prior to the this summit on 24th, in fact, even prior to the virtual summit which took place in March, the third Quad foreign ministers meeting, which was held in February 2021 via teleconference, had marked a huge change in the sense that for the first time, the participants did not hide the fact that the grouping was moving towards some sort of a security frame. Even if India in particular and Australia as well hate to call it a military alliance. The aim was clear: to counter China's forceful attempts to change the status quo, particularly in the Western Pacific. So if you take 2004 Asian tsunami, after which, because of the initiatives of Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, he was the first one to initiate the effort. We used to call it Quad 1.0. And I always feel that the 2017 Foreign Secretary level meeting that took place during the Manila ARF summit, Manila ARF conference, could be called Quad 2.0 because actually it appeared thereafter to become a damp squib for various reasons. So we might as well call this as Quad 3.0 because of the seminal changes that it has offered. But must say that the 2017 FS level meeting was also an inflection point, for it had set the stage for formal ministerial level meetings. Thereafter, the first foreign minister level meeting took place in 2019. And it was sequentially followed by the first properly, and one might admit now, deliberately choreographed quadrilateral naval exercise under the name of Malabar in November last year. Now, we kept saying it is sheer coincidence that those four countries which are in Quad, they are in Malabar, but there was a reason to it, and it was a deliberate and I think very well choreographed reason. That event, therefore, was certainly intended to convey or broadcast our intent. It's actually been 15 years after former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe of Japan proposed the grouping in the wake of the Asian tsunami, I think in Jan 2005. But this in-person meeting of the leaders on the 24th of September did set tongues wagging across the world this time. for the four nations to move from a virtual format into the in-person realm within the short space of just 6 months has been a major leap of faith. Perhaps pushed by events in South Asia that particularly relates to Afghanistan, as well as in the Western Pacific, where China is just not looking back at all. The summit also showed the US involvement in the Indo-Pacific region is now growing in many ways, particularly since the new administration has taken over, which augurs well for the balance of power theorem with China. This summit was obviously meant to signal a proactive stance by the US despite embarrassing events, including America's hasty withdrawal and takeover of Afghanistan by the Taliban, causing a massive upheaval across the world. Just to remind ourselves, the first announcements by the Taliban, after it said that whether you like it or not, we've taken over, was calling China as their most valuable partner. And they've opened discrete channels of communication with the PRC government. Then, as the chair just pointed out, there's been a 7 magnitude tremor, as I call it, by the secretly negotiated AUKUS Pact between the US, UK, and Australia. It actually has, for the moment, put paid to a Quad Plus, which could include important powers like France, who have been underscoring their vital interest in the Indo-Pacific because of French Polynesia and various other assets, including the Reunion Islands in the Indian Ocean. So given these circumstances, this summit was very essential to be in person, not just to signal, but also to convey joint formal statements and the kind of body language that was seen to say we are not naming China, but we are certainly everything other than climate change that was mentioned over there had something to do with China. It was a good formal meeting of minds. For Japan in particular, it meant a vindication of its free and open Indo-Pacific, or FOIP, as Shinzo Abe enunciated, well ahead of time. However, we also need to tread with cautious optimism. Last time the Quad came together in 2007, you'll recall, with an exercise called Malabar TAC 2 in the Bay of Bengal. Member countries had many reservations, especially Australia. As you remember, it suddenly decided after the exercise that China's laments were not digestible. And as soon as Kevin Rudd took over, he said he was withdrawing. And China had extensive economic ties with China, Australia had extensive economic ties with China. The project was unfortunately abruptly aborted in a classic case of the baby being thrown out with the bathwater. But things have come a full circle now, with Australia-China relations dropping to an all-time low. Yet the possibility remains of one or more Quad members could well include Australia, may not include India, still getting cold feet. It will take much more than this in-person summit to keep the flock together. And for good reason, the leaders decided that hereafter the summit will take place annually. For the US and Japan, there is the North Korean challenge as well, especially as it has tested both cruise and ballistic missiles in the past couple of months with higher intensity and frequency than before. Meanwhile, Japan is headed for a leadership change in just a day or two. So the new incumbent too will have to be seen for his views or continuum of Shinzo Abe's initiative. The four leaders had announced an agenda before they met, which included focus on deepening ties and advancing practical cooperation in areas such as combating COVID-19, addressing the climate crisis, partnering on emerging technologies and cyberspace, and promoting a free and open Indo-Pacific, or FOIP. So this time it was a clear indication that the cooperation between the Quad countries will extend beyond security to other areas as well. The current US administration has brought a sea change in its approach to areas like climate change and clean energy from those terrible days of his predecessor, who nearly dumped allies in the Pacific and crashed climate change agreements. It was also clear that the four countries are likely to try to work on an alternative to the China-led BRI without naming it in as many words. This could include merging initiatives like Japan's Partnership for Quality Infrastructure and the current US administration's Build Back Better World initiative. The best thing that could happen to India and other emerging economies would be tying up on the technology front, provided we get it at the right price. This is because Chinese firms like Huawei are seen as security risks, whether for spectrum that we faced or for 5G. What remains conspicuously clear is that the Quad is likely to remain a major area of focus of the new US administration, given the setback in Afghanistan, as I said, and America's desire to show that it remains committed to the Indo-Pacific region. So Quad is perhaps here to stay, and particularly because they've decided to do an annual summit. On his part, Prime Minister Modi said that he firmly believed that the grouping of four democracies would act as a force for global good and ensure peace and prosperity in the Indo-Pacific, as well as the entire world. He also proposed that there should be common international traveling protocols involving mutual recognition of the COVID-19 vaccination certificate. I think it conveyed a message to the entire world, particularly Europe and UK. Apart from a common approach to emerging technologies, cybersecurity, and addressing the challenge of climate change, the four leaders specifically vowed to pursue this FOIP, or Free and Open Indo-Pacific, undaunted by coercion, actual words, which was a very clear, loud and clear signal to China. The joint statement also said we stand for the rule of law, freedom of navigation and overflight, peaceful resolution of disputes, which of course has become too stereotyped, democratic values, and territorial integrity of states. While China was not mentioned in the public remarks by any one of the leaders, or in the lengthy joint statement and a fact sheet issued afterwards, Beijing was clearly at the top of their mind. Their statement made frequent mention of the leaders' insistence on rules-based behavior in a region where China has been trying to flex its muscle. They also voiced support for small island states, especially those in the Pacific, in order to enhance their economic and environmental resilience. Additionally, the four leaders in the joint statement urged North Korea to engage in diplomacy over its nuclear weapons and ballistic missile program, which, of course, Kim Jong-un has refused to do unless international sanctions are dropped. Now, India's plan to resume vaccine exports came in for special mention by the four. Prime Minister Modi said India would permit export of 8 million COVID-19 vaccine doses by the end of October under a deal the grouping reached in March during the virtual summit to supply 1 billion doses to the Indo-Pacific by end 22. Now it may get slightly more delayed. The Quad announced several new pacts, including one to bolster supply chain security for semiconductors, as the chair just highlighted, and to combat illegal fishing, a direct pointer at China, IUU, and boost maritime domain awareness, at which India has taken the lead, far ahead of the Europeans and the Americans, since we rolled out what is called a white shipping agreement and invited friendly foreign countries liaison officers in our IMAC facility in Gurgaon. The Quad also rolled out a 5G partnership and plans to track climate change. It also said we will work together towards facilitating public-private cooperation and demonstrate in 2022 the scalability and cyber security of open standards-based technology. On his part, Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison said AUKUS and the Quad were mutually reinforcing. He said the whole point of the AUKUS is that they are not there to replace anything, but to add to the Quad. China, on its part, as expected, appeared to criticize the Quad. It denounced the Quad as previously as a Cold War construct and said the AUKUS alliance would intensify a regional arms race. Its foreign ministry spokesperson on the 25th said a closed, exclusive clique targeting other countries runs counter to the trend of the times and the aspirations of regional countries. It will find no support and is doomed to fail. So the change to an in-person summit became reality, particularly when Xi Jinping proved he could undermine the existing international order, covet other countries' territory, despite the 2016 ICLOS verdict, and even dent others' economic prosperity to supplant China's own. One of the triggers for the upsurge and change of posture of the Quad has been the new Coast Guard law enacted by the Standing Committee of China's National People's Congress, passed in January this year, with the law taking effect on February 1. The new law violates all overriding tenets of UNCLOS. It allows the Chinese Coast Guard to go and open fire. They have not done so till now in the Senkaku Islands, but the fact is that they are using this unconventional form of deterrence by arming their Coast Guard, which has not been done by any other country. If therefore Quad 3.0, as I call it, has got China's vote, it should be good news for us all the same. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Anupji. It has been really an excellent and very overarching survey of the entire Indo-Pacific scene, Quad, AUKUS. And as you said, Quad is here to stay. And though there will be problem to keep the flock together, I think the resolve or the determination on part of the Quad members, as witnessed during the Quad summit, is quite clear that we would like this grouping to be strengthened further, and our whole idea to stand against the Chinese expansionist, Chinese arbitrary policies, and you have very rightly mentioned this new Coast Guard law, and similar actions of China have to be resisted. I think that is the signal, and the Chinese, I hope, receive it in full measure. So thank you. May I now call upon Professor Swaran Singh to kindly share his perspective with us. He is observing this Chinese attitude towards Quad very closely, and I think he should be able to throw light on what the Chinese reaction has been in the last 3-4 days to the events in Washington. Over to you, Professor Swaran Singh.
Thank you, sir, and thank you for making me part of this very important discussion. I also very intently heard Admiral Anup Singh's very nicely sharing with us the growth trajectory of various inflection points, as he called them, and where Quad stands today. And I equally look forward to listening to Ambassador Viren Nanda for his practitioner's advantage of having been High Commissioner in Australia, Indonesia, and ASEAN. But let me share a few ideas of my own with you and hope that you will find them interesting enough. Since Ambassador Dewari just mentioned China is the country that I kind of take interest in studying what it does. Let me put my neck out directly and say the whole idea of Indo-Pacific would not have been the reality if unprecedented rise of China had not taken place.
Yeah.
So from the divided conflict zones of Pacific being separate from Indian Ocean, it is the unprecedented rise of China, we like it or hate it, that made economics far more significant component of national power. It is not just China, but global trends are like that. And China kind of added on to accelerating that shift from purely military-based national power to more comprehensive national strength being more interesting. And if I could take a slight aside to say, had countries like Japan and Germany become economic powers in 21st century, they would have perhaps received far more notice and respect around the world. Because they became economic powers during the Second Cold War, so to say, when the focus was on nuclear weapons and military power. They perhaps did not get enough traction in global decision making the way Chinese are able to get. That apart, of course, that they were also allies of United States, and therefore United States continued to kind of treat them as a second fiddle in their own global arrangements. So that's the first point, that China's economic rise and its enormous trade and investment with the entire Indian Ocean and Pacific Ocean littoral made what was seen as originally choke point of Malacca Straits to first a buffer, then a bridge now, to make it look like this was the region, even though the process began with the flying geese model of Japan. This is the region which is seen with much rapid economic growth rates, and therefore the global gravitation shifts to geoeconomics and from North Atlantic to Indo-Pacific. What is equally most interesting is that in at least the mainstream debates on Indo-Pacific, China still continues to be an outlier. India has made the occasional ritual noises of ensuring China joins Indo-Pacific narratives, but that apart, nobody else is happy to see China join so-called Western narratives of the Indo-Pacific region. Chinese themselves have stayed enormously reluctant, almost reticent, because they want to first ensure, that whole world first comes to accepting South China Sea as part of China's sovereign territory before they engage the Indo-Pacific narratives out in open, because otherwise, at least Australian scholars always call South China Sea the hub of Indian Ocean, Indo-Pacific imaginations. So Chinese have their own reluctance of not really showcasing their own interest very lately, last 2 years. So it's just 2 years that Chinese scholars are beginning to talk about it. So fundamentally, I think what I'm trying to underline is at least the conception of Indo-Pacific is very China-triggered, China-driven. And very closely related to that is the fact that Chinese have not completely given up its own vision on Indo-Pacific region. And mention was made, for instance, to Maritime Silk Road and the larger idea of Belt and Road Initiative, which is very often now sort of put together as Xi Jinping's building of community of shared futures of humankind. That is the larger vision, which matches the vision of United States and its friends and allies, who also want to bring to the table far more normative way of looking at what they are seeking to achieve in terms of stability, security, or even prosperity in this region. So there are the two kind of projections of what kind of Indo-Pacific order we are trying to build, in which Chinese is, of course, one country driven idea of building a community of shared destiny. And they have their own understanding of what kind of order they want to build. In each case, they are not the country that goes out and asks whether you have a democracy, whether you have human rights before they go and invest in these countries. So they have their own attraction for several countries in the region. And we have seen over a period of time, China becoming not just a great friend of Taliban, but also a great friend of many other countries. And that increasingly puts enormous pressure on the world leader, United States. to ensure that its writ still runs large here in the region. And that is why United States has increasingly focused on building alternative structures in the Indo-Pacific geopolitical framework, in that sense, treating that as a one theater, large theater. And of course, Indo-Pacific Naval Command that Donald Trump had sort of given a nomenclature to the Pacific Command. Now, three networks are being built here. Some mention was also made. First, of course, is Quadrilateral Security Framework, as we call it now, with their second summit meeting, first in person, in which India is, shall we say, India is the least allied ally of the Quad nations, which is the country that also equally engages. In fact, just before going to Washington, Prime Minister was engaging in Shanghai Cooperation Organization and BRICS nation summit. So India is an interesting country in that sense. Others are, of course, old allies of United States. And the second very important network is one which is called Five Eyes. It was being revamped during President Trump's period. It again has basically United States and its allies of post-Second World War period, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, United Kingdom, and United States. And the last one, which Admiral Singh just now mentioned, AUKUS, which again brings United States allies together. So fundamentally, networks are being increasingly driven by rise of China and the way it behaves and the way it has its own, whether you call it misadventures or opaqueness, debt traps, whatever, various kind of expressions have been made in Western narratives on what is happening as far as China is concerned. But that is the main trigger for why United States is busy launching one after another networks. Now, when United States is launching these networks in Indo-Pacific region, it has, missed out working with its NATO allies. So we can hear the kind of very, very disjointed voices coming not only from Turkey, but now from France. And indeed, you would also remember that after that AUKUS was announced and France withdrew its ambassadors from United States and Australia, President Joe Biden was, I wouldn't say desperately, he was trying to talk to Emmanuel Macron, who wasn't returning the call or wasn't fixing the time. And before Indian Prime Minister boarded the flight to Washington on the last evening, Emmanuel Macron speaks to Indian Prime Minister. So you look at another question emerging where they talk in detail about how France and India, and by extension, European Union, in fact, European Union has also made certain very polite noises in support of France's sentiments. India being a close partner of France and European nations in ensuring peace, security, stability, etc. in the Pacific region. So multiple sort of disjunctions within these players one can notice, just as Britain jumps in after Brexit to be part of the AUKUS, France is moving in a slightly different direction and looks at India. Of course, India, France in the last 5 years have also developed their own better understanding in terms of Indian Ocean or defense cooperation, etc., etc. So multiple players are here. So how does India fit into these multiple players? Obviously, India is preoccupied, if not obsessed, with strategic autonomy, and it stays so, if not non-alignment. So India would not have in any case liked to be part of any of these other, whether Five Eyes or it is AUKUS, because remember the speech of Prime Minister at Shangri-La Dialogue 2018, he had underlined he wouldn't like to see Indo-Pacific becoming an exclusive club of any few countries. It should be open, and he was repeatedly inviting Russia and China to come into it. And he underlined he doesn't want to see it militarized. So India is located where it has its own comfort zone, which is Quad. And now Quad is becoming India's platform to jumpstart or catapult itself from no longer being a South Asian country to now becoming an international player. Pandemic is a great challenge, but also turned a great opportunity for India, because India is now being supported by these other major nations in finance, in technology, in materials, in goodwill, standing together next to each other in ensuring and accelerating manufacturing of vaccines in India. And India's produced vaccines are now going to perhaps restart again export from October to go around the world in that sense. So pandemic, if you join it together with what Quad has been doing and how pandemic issues have become important for Quad, I think provides unusual advantage India to showcase India's very different stature at global level. Same is climate change in that sense. You know, India's International Solar Alliance, along with France, again, remember, it's not Quad country as of now, has nearly 75, 78 countries are participating. India, United States have a clean energy agenda for 2050. So India's contribution to climate change, and finally terrorism. Surprisingly, Quad, because of the shyness that Biden administration has in not talking anything about Afghanistan, was not emphasized far too much. There's a paragraph that talks about Afghanistan, but that wasn't a major issue. Whereas for Indian Prime Minister, wherever he goes, Afghanistan and particularly terrorism has always been a constant issue. You would recall that in Xiamen BRICS Summit of 2017, 3 full paragraphs were adopted on terrorism, talking about naming and shaming Jaish-e-Mohammed, Lashkar-e-Toiba, Pakistan. Now, compared to that being a kind of an unusual achievement of Indian diplomacy to put that much of focus of BRICS SCO summit meeting into terrorism, the current statement does not really spend far. I think there are about 17 paragraphs and 1 paragraph on terrorism, which is not also very emphatically speaking Indian language in that sense. So India's global role in building an international convention on terrorism at the United Nations, now being a country which is increasingly setting what would be the benchmarks at the global level, at least in the global community led by United States on the one side, and again on terrorism disjunction with countries like Turkey, Pakistan, China, Russia, who have a different take on how they want to deal with Taliban, which is to me a regional issue. That disjunction again impacts on what Quad can and cannot do, and therefore you notice a certain amount of caution in how much they want to speak in their joint statement on terrorism issue. So India has its own advantages, but I think on terrorism, India has not gained full traction that it usually gets in international forums in Quad. And that is my last point to say, perhaps Quad is under stress of China's constant rise. You have all noticed that Chinese now are celebrating having crossed 100 trillion yuan GDP, which is almost hitting 16 trillion yuan, 16 trillion current dollar terms. And so they have deep pockets. You may not like the way they operate, but they can constantly go on investing in some of these countries where they don't ask questions about democracy. And those regimes are happy to engage China in that sense. And some of them even in Europe are doing that. So that constant stress and the recession in G7 economies, which is pushing them now to talk about, blue dot networks and build better world, build better health sector, which is more normative and discursive rather than empirical on the ground promises to be made, which is Chinese are able to do that. So I think increasingly one notices that in terms of deep pockets, China continues to have advantage and therefore will continue to cause anxiety in Quad countries and to some extent guide in what direction Quad and other networks like Five Eyes or AUKUS will evolve in coming times. But definitely India is at home with normative discourses. And if Quad continues to be, and so our other networks continue to be speaking the language of building institutions, quality controls, rule of law, fair trade and things like these, India is much at home in engaging itself with that in a limited bandwidth of quadrilateral security framework, which has now added so many other things other than the 3 working groups that we had kind of looked at as what Quad is doing. And they are now moving to space technologies, to 5G technologies. They have even created fellowships. What I'm saying is they are becoming more like India's vision of what India is at home with. So definitely India will continue to be at home with the how Quad is evolving, but whether Quad will be able to stand up to China, I would not give it full marks. I think it still has enormous challenges, and the bigger idea of building community of shared destiny of humankind is a parallel narrative funded by deep pockets which has its own strengths, and therefore I think it would constantly try to balance China. But whether it will end up marginalizing China, I wouldn't put my money on that. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much, Professor Swaran Singh. You have made several very important points. I think what you said is that China is not giving up its narrative on Indo-Pacific. I think it's something which we have to keep in mind. And the kind of response which China receives from a number of countries, be it in Southeast Asia or Central Asia or Africa, despite their policies and actions, I think something we have to take really note of. India has, on this platform of Quad, started marching on. There are, as you mentioned, number of benefits. India has the opportunity to showcase its strengths, and in many ways, what you mentioned at the end, that the agenda, the wider agenda of Quad is now virtually India's agenda or India's vision, be in terms of peace, prosperity, technological development, also bringing in the element of terrorism, which other countries are shying to speak about. And I think there is an all-comprehensive agenda or vision that India is bringing to the Quad. But we will have still, I think, a number of difficulties in pushing that further. I find Australia's position in this whole Indo-Pacific debate and the actions on AUKUS and Quad is they have certainly moved away from China. And if otherwise in the past, Australia used to take a rather ambivalent position with respect to their policies towards China. And now I think they have now virtually given up as far as their relationship with China is concerned. Whether that will sustain, because in Australia, governments change every 3 years, and what will be the position of the next government, whether that will impact on Australia's position in Quad and AUKUS also needs to be seen. But finally, what you mentioned, that this is a kind of a normative approach we seem to be taking with respect to Quad, and if we can help build Quad also as an institution, I think that would be, but an institution not just for the sake of an institution. It has to have a certain clear directive and agenda of its own. I'm afraid I think BRICS perhaps or SCO are currently moving in a direction in which they don't seem to have neither do they have the teeth nor clear vision. So there are a number of implications of these developments. How countries in Southeast Asia, in the Indo-Pacific, are really reacting to it. I think, Biren, you must be observing the ASEAN scene very closely. Also, Swaran mentioned North Korea. What is the position of countries in Northeast Asia also, as well as in Central Asia? So we would like to hear your take, your perspective on the whole Indo-Pacific debate that is going on, particularly in the context of Quad and now AUKUS also. So over to you, Biren, please.
I want to begin by discussing Quad in the context of great power relations, on how the interaction between US, dynamics of US policy and Chinese policy, and how Biden himself has changed US policy at the edges. And then I'll briefly touch upon the reaction of ASEAN countries to the Quad and to the efforts by the United States and its allies and partners to balance China in Southeast Asia. So let me begin. The defining nature of strategic development since the global financial crisis of 2007-8 is a rising China making territorial assertions in the South and East China Seas and along the India-China border. The PLA Navy and Air Force has also engaged in coercive maneuvering off the coast of Taiwan. The broader strategic context is China's effort to supplant the United States as the preeminent power in Asia. These trends have been accentuated after the COVID crisis broke out in November 2019. In response, the US has focused on its Indo-Pacific strategy, strengthened its alliance and partnerships, and the web of trilateral and 2+2 dialogues for better policy coordination between India, Japan, Australia, and itself. The Quad, recently elevated to the summit level, sits at the apex of these dialogues. The Quad should be seen as part of the countervailing strategies adopted in the Indo-Pacific to counter an aggressive and assertive China. China, on the other hand, regards the Quad and bilaterals as quasi-alliances aimed at itself. Though committed to continuing a vigorous policy to counter the Chinese challenge, Biden has signaled important differences in his approach. Gone is the America First paradigm, is committed to historic partnerships and will henceforth work with allies and partners. The strategic perspectives of the Biden administration, however, are largely similar to the Indo-Pacific strategy adopted by the Trump administration. Like his predecessor, Biden remains committed to engaging with India and enhancing its role as a major defense partner to counter China's influence in the region. Confrontation, competition, and cooperation with China continue to be the paradigm for US strategic policy toward China and represent a tectonic shift after 1971. Chinese scholars increasingly believe that the current state of US-China relations is the new normal. The two countries are engaged in a game of strategic bluff, and China's strategic determination and stamina to fight back are being tested. Whoever blinks first will lose. However, the US continues to suffer from imperial fatigue, and China is no longer willing to play second fiddle. Quad members share the desire to moderate China's unilateral and hegemonic assertions. Maritime cooperation among Quad countries began after the Indian Ocean tsunami of 2004, but today the countries, all democracies and vibrant economies, work on a far broader agenda which includes tackling security, economic, and health issues. From Beijing's perspective, the Quad represents a Cold War mentality, a united front against China. In a telephonic conversation on September 9, Presidents Biden and Xi had a broad strategic discussions in which they discussed areas where their interests converged and areas where their interest, values, and perspectives diverged. This discussion, as President Biden made clear, was part of the United States' ongoing effort to responsibly manage the competition between the United States and the PRC. Chinese state broadcaster CCTV said the phone call was candid and in-depth, adding that it had covered extensive strategic communication and issues of mutual concern. President Xi said whether China and the US can properly handle their relations is critical for the future and destiny of the world. The United States seems to have taken urgent measures to stem the narrative of decline that was triggered by its shambolic departure from Afghanistan. The announcement of a new security partnership, AUKUS, which will enable Australia to equip its navy with nuclear-propelled attack submarines, is a clear signal to China, as well as to American allies in Asia, that Washington is determined about stepping up to meet Beijing's challenge in the Indo-Pacific region. In his first address to the UNGA, President Joe Biden declared that the world is at an inflection point in history, urging countries to join forces to tackle threats such as climate change and pandemics, or else risk failing in ways that will reverberate for generations. Having ended a 20-year-long relentless war in Afghanistan, Biden said the United States is ready for a new era, and it intends to face modern transnational threats through diplomacy, developmental aid, and partnerships, and not military force. And although America does not seek a new Cold War, it nonetheless intends to compete vigorously with rising powers that do not always share its values or interests, he said in a veiled reference to China. The first in-person Quad summit reiterated and reaffirmed the evolving Quad agenda. The institutionalization of high-level meetings and the establishment of working groups to carry the agenda forward in key areas will perhaps be the most enduring outcome of the summit. Assessing the outcome of the first in-person summit and the prospects for the Quad starts with the common interests that have drawn the four countries together. These can be grouped into geostrategic interests and those concerning the nature of the international order. First, all four nations share an abiding interest in maintaining a stable balance of power in the Indo-Pacific and preventing a regional state from becoming dominant. Second, all four states share an interest in deterring the use of forceful or coercive practices to resolve political and territorial disputes in the region. Third, as trading nations, all Quad members share a deep interest in maintaining a maritime order based on free movement of goods and services across the world's oceans. Fourth, since China seeks to lead in key technology areas as part of its desire to become the Asian hegemon by 2050, Quad members share a common interest in limiting the flow of sensitive technology to China. Restructuring semiconductor supply chains to exclude China has become a key priority for the Quad. Building resilient, diverse, and secure technology supply chains for hardware, software, and services, and the harmonization of standards and benchmarks is a key objective in line with Quad members' national interests. Fifth, the Quad has adopted a wide array of global initiatives related to the pandemic and climate change. Sixth, the Quad has adopted an infrastructure partnership that focuses on sustainable development and transparency that could provide a viable alternative to BRI. How is India affected by the first Quad summit? First, from a strategic perspective, India continues to move closer to the United States even as it retains its strategic independence. How China approaches differences with India will in the future in part determine whether this posture will change. Even though it could be argued that the Quad agenda is in line with, will inevitably add to simmering tensions with China. China likely views India as the most vulnerable link in the Quad. Unlike three alliance members, it does not benefit from security assurances from the US, but the strategic partnership with the US does give it access to the state-of-the-art defense equipment, which increases its comprehensive national power. Now, coming to the reaction of Southeast Asian states, I think they are probably still in the same position as Australia was 2-3 years ago, of being a bit about having to decide between their security partner and their economic partner, because prosperity of these countries has, in large measure, has been due to the US-led security alliances and also to the trade and investment ties with China. So it is these linkages and production chains with China and the two-way investment that has taken place, which has been the main reason why these countries have become so prosperous. And they fear that this prosperity is at risk because of these developments, regardless of who is responsible for the current state of affairs. And Australia was also very much thinking along these lines, but I think the Chinese overplayed their hand. They launched influence operations, they threatened the Australians, they made demands of them. So they stopped buying products, certain products which were of very great importance to Australians for their exports. They stopped buying these products for some time. So for all these reasons, this caused a shift, paradigm shift, the way Australia looked at it. And so I think Chinese are responsible for this, their part of the diplomatic wrangling. And definitely the Chinese are also responsible for what has been happening at the global strategic level, because of the fact that they have relentlessly pursued territorial assertions and not relied on diplomacy, and they have succeeded in riling all major powers and many regional actors. So no great power, no superpower, no great power can succeed if it the broad-based opposition of other partners in the region or other countries in the region. This is exactly what happened to Germany in the Second World War. This is exactly what is happening to China now. Of course, China has not reached the inflection point at which things are going to get irrevocably worse. The Chinese could try to retrieve the situation. Signaled that he would not like to use force as the first resort. Pursue a policy of development aid, partnerships, and diplomacy, and use coercive military measures only as a last resort, and that he's not in favor of a Cold War at the global stage. But so these are all, I think, things that we should at face value, and we should be positive in our appraisal of these statements. And I think it would benefit everybody if there could be a wider global understanding on the contentious issues that divide China and other countries.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Nanda. Thank you. In addition to a number of points which you made, what I find it striking is we have to analyze further how the Chinese will be now reacting to our participation in Quad, even though we are, as was pointed out earlier, we are the only non-ally of the United States in this. But we already have the border dispute raging between India and China. The military confrontation is going on. In the context of that, have the Chinese linked our participation in Quad to the current ongoing crisis? I have not seen any comments from Beijing on this particular aspect, but I think it would be worth studying whether they're linking it. Secondly, you pointed out how Chinese have riled number of powers, number of countries in the region, especially Australia, and how that really put off the Australians to such an extent that they have more or less given up their relationship with Chinese and joined whole hog the Western Alliance now. Would they do the same, or will they be much more cautious vis-a-vis other Southeast Asian countries? Because in Southeast Asia you already have US allies, countries like Thailand, South Korea. You have countries like Singapore, which are very close to the US, and they have been very cautious the last 4 or 5 years. They were hoping, and they were rather expecting much more action from the US whenever the US talked of rebalancing or the pivot to Asia. But the disappointment with the US continued. Now, while this was going on, the Chinese were building their economic strengths, alliances with the countries of Southeast Asia. The value chains were being developed. Investment from China into Southeast Asia was also coming. Now, in this kind of atmosphere, the line which the Southeast Asian took, which you just now mentioned, that economic partnership with China and security umbrella or security assurance from the US, those were the kind of guidelines which the Southeast Asians were following. Now, that can perhaps undergo change, because if the assurances of the Americans are not followed up, if the Quad or the AUKUS promises are not fulfilled, then the choices or the options that countries of the Indo-Pacific have will perhaps be further diluted. I think we will have to watch the situation. But the Chinese, as Professor Swaran Singh mentioned, are not giving up their narrative on Indo-Pacific. They still have deep pockets, and they will go all way, to maintain their position. So the geopolitics of this whole region, Indo-Pacific, will, I think, mainly depend on not only the announcements and the vision documents which the Quad or AUKUS and the Americans bring out, but will really depend on actual programs of action, what these countries really bring to the table. So I think this is the dilemma that I envisage in the coming years, when Quad and AUKUS and other initiatives of this Western Alliance and India joining with them now are put before countries of this Indo-Pacific. Well, we have had a very interesting presentations from three very eminent speakers. Are there any questions, any observations? Ambassador Doshi, Professor Ashok Seth, see you have joined us in between. Welcome to the discussion. Any questions or points to make? Yeah, Ambassador Doshi, please. Unmute yourself.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay. First, thank you very much, Sudhir, for inviting me to this. I've really learned a lot and filled many gaps in my knowledge, listening to the real experts on this, and you yourself, all four of you. I have one question. Lately, many strategic experts and others in China have been talking about China's core concerns. The core concerns are, most of them, of course, in the Western Pacific. And I presume that we can also, the core concerns include the concern with us. In the Western Pacific, the core concerns include Taiwan, the South China Sea, and the Senkaku Islands, principally. Then, of course, what they are doing in Hong Kong, that's also part of the core concerns. My question now, of these, the lowest hanging fruit is Taiwan. Considering the present situation, how much time do you give, any of you give, before China actually makes a move on Taiwan?
Well, $1 million question, but you never know. It could be well within the reach of the Chinese, and the kind of expansionist policies and designs they have been displaying, it may not be out of the realm of possibility. But would Professor Swaran like to comment on this? Swaran?
Let me try. As you mentioned, this is a rather complex, I would even dare say, a bit of a rhetorical question. What I want to underline is that we perhaps need to look at the methodologies of China being different when it seeks to expand its influence. A mention of Hong Kong was made. We don't hear any debate blaming United Kingdom for leasing that territory for 99 years, but we blame China when it leases the territory in Hambantota in Sri Lanka. We may have views of two countries which are at variance. So China fundamentally is not planning to, sort of invade Taiwan the way Western nations imagine in terms of territorial sovereignty being sanctimonious. China has already invaded Taiwan in that sense. From old language of Mao saying we need integration of Taiwan to assimilation of Taiwan, to winning hearts and minds, each next leader has given new nuance to what they want to do with Taiwan. So in that sense, I don't think that Chinese will ever give the pleasure to the United States of physically invading militarily that island country. The converse, the opposite example would be the one of 1995, when Taiwan for the first time decided to hold democratic elections. And there was enormous tension. Chinese were trying missile tests. And a kind of a scenario was being built that China could do something nasty. I remember at that time, I think President Clinton was in office. All we heard was enormous rhetoric. And even from the dates that were given as to when the American fleet would be entering the Taiwan Straits, they were delayed by 3, 4, 5 days, I think. So despite that Taiwan Relations Act, assuming China goes berserk or foolish to launch a physical attack on Taiwan, I am not too sure if United States is going to take on China simply because Taiwan is being sort of on the anvil for a loss. I'm saying that's a kind of a very rhetorical, very hypothetical question. My greater trust is that Chinese are not going to fall prey to physically launching an attack on Taiwan. Taiwan for Chinese is already fully integrated in terms of economy, society, folklore, music, education, intellectuals, everything. So I don't think that Chinese are, let me also provoke, I think, further discussion by saying Chinese have shown extreme flexibility compared to how rigid sometimes the United States can behave by, accepting Hong Kong in terms where even after Hong Kong comes back to motherland, it has to stay the same as British wanted to keep Hong Kong for next 50 years. That's a great accommodation. They still have different flag, different currency. I find it easier to enter Hong Kong sometimes than Chinese find to enter Hong Kong. So Chinese would show some flexibility with Taiwan as well. I think they've shown that flexibility over a period of time. So Chinese invasion of Taiwan will happen so imperceptibly that Western lens will fail us to even know what happened.
Thank you.
Vineshji,
Thank you.
Mr.
I've been
Tripathi, you are all namaskar. How are you? Let me briefly introduce you to others. We have Mr. S.N. Tripathi, he is also attending it. He is the Director General of the Indian Institute of Public Administration. You all know IIPA. He is the former Secretary, Department of Ministry of Information Technology, and now the Director General of the IIPA. Sorry, kahiye. Who was muted?
इशारा मेरे तरफ था. I'm now unmuted. As I said, I have been listening with a lot of care and learning to the learned analysis which has gone on for about an hour. I have basically 3 observations to make. The meeting which took place in Washington amongst the 4 constituent countries, if I can call it even that, of the Quad relationship was rooted more on the UN General Assembly occasion than a purposeful meeting of 4 people. Therefore, I do not attach too much significance to it. The only importance that I attach is they were persuaded enough to use that opportunity to get together. They did not generate that opportunity, and I think there is a difference between the two. It follows, therefore, that there is no cutting edge to Quad besides a hypothetical aspirational thinking of what the 3 countries besides US may want. You already have AUKUS, and the relationship between AUKUS and Quad remains to be defined, but even that I'm willing to overlook. If the purpose is to contain China, for whatever reasons, China has clarity of focus, a tenacity of pursuit, and the resources to do so. I don't even see a token secretariat for Quad. It is full of platitudes. Something like, they said, Sarve bhavantu sukhina, sarve santu niramaya. May all be happy. May they all be without temptation. These are pious thoughts. Now, you don't need 4 nations to get together to talk of vaccination or cultural change or any of that sort of thing. To put it briefly, I would like to see what is the focus of Quad. Pious statements which are well-intentioned do not get mileage. They do not even blunt the skepticism. Therefore, I have my reservations on the way Quad is headed. Maybe it will come in time. Maybe it won't come in time. I'm willing to be patient about it. This is my first submission. My second submission is, if you don't even have a secretariat, how does the exchange of conversations, data, perceptions, covert or overt, ever take place? The least they could have done is set up a token coordination agency. Even that hasn't taken place. And I don't think any of these four luminaries need basic education on how international diplomacy will get a bite, a focus, speed forward, unless there is some coordinating mechanism put in place. My third concern is even more basic. You have so many of these aspirational relationships growing. Look at what has happened about the alliance around the Bay of Bengal countries. You get an occasional meeting of the leaders, an occasional dialogue. We ourselves have organized a whole day's session on this. What was the conclusion we came to? In operational terms, even for Rohingyas, movement of human beings across the ocean doesn't have a clearly defined focus because there are other variables. To put it all in a mode to sum it up, I'm willing to look at Quad with enthusiasm. I'm willing to look at Quad with hope, because that's the way I react to any suggestion. There'll be plenty of people to point out what's wrong with it. But looking at it with hope also carries with us the responsibility to say what else can be done, should have been done, needs to be done to take it forward. So, Mr. Chairman, using your munificence to provide me this opportunity to react, I have tried to table my suggestions on what could be the possible way forward. And I'm willing to wait to see these four leaders at least keeping in touch, to see the writing on the wall, which is quite obvious. China is not easy to tame, cannot be tamed. It has been tried all over in different directions of China's expansion, west, south, east, even northeast with Russia. There is no going back, the way I see it. So it is a question of realizing that the threat is not just territorial, but the threat is of world hegemony. And I agree with the speakers. China has made a strong claim for world hegemony and replacing USA as a fulcrum of world relationships. And I don't entirely overlook the conspiracy theory related to COVID. If it hasn't been proved, it hasn't been disproved either. But the international relations affected by COVID have substantially changed. One of the channels this morning was showing nearly acres of land around memorials in Washington, which simply carry the name of the people who are dead, by their families celebrating their having been on this planet and lamenting their death. And it is just acres of it. That has been the extent of damage of COVID. I think we haven't even fully grasped what the numbers of the deaths of COVID mean. Which of us here haven't lost a dear friend or a relationship in COVID or been affected by it in some manner? It was not just by accident. And I don't know at which level the conspiracy entered or whether there was a conspiracy or not, but then I'm not even willing to believe that there was no conspiracy at all, or even a willing fanning of the embers. I'd like to stop there because a lot of the observations which I have made are merely by way of loud thinking to a group of wise people whose judgment and wisdom and learning I respect. Because if I'm to come in here and make my remarks as the chairman invited me to, I'm not here to say what is Quad and what is a quadrilateral relationship of international relations. That's not at the level. So I've confined my remarks to what all would I have expected, what all I expect to see happen for it to have meaning. I have suggested some ways of doing it and embedded it in a larger environment of changing international relations. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Vineshal ji. I think this kind of loud thinking is very important and very useful because we would like to have the whole range of views on issues like this. And I'm so happy that you gave your very independent thinking on this whole matter. I think we greatly respect that. And I think in discussions like this, the utility or the importance of such thoughts cannot be overemphasized. Thank you very much. Ashok ji, or otherwise, you have anything to say or comment?
I could add a minor comment.
Yeah, please.
Basically saying that I think we don't have to feel so pessimistic about what has happened during the recent meeting. And in spite of the fact that AUKUS has possibly, I think, diluted what we were thinking would come out of Quad, but we can also take it positively. Let us say, like, for example, Viren Datta has said that there are two different aspects. One is the security aspect, the other is, let's say, the economy aspect. So Quad is relating more to economy and I think general welfare, including, for example, distribution of medicines and providing, let's say, bilateral, not only bilateral, but I would say multilateral economic development, which I think is a very positive thing. And I think India, for example, is better placed in that instead of taking head on the security measures, which would have possibly provoked China. And I think we've had more problem on the northern front. And I think otherwise also, I think the US and their allies are possibly not very keen to, I think, share, for example, the nuclear submarine technology and others with us. So I think we have to be satisfied with what I think the developments have happened. That is what my feeling is.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Well, before I conclude, I would like to thank Professor Swaran Singh, Ambassador Biren Nanda, and Admiral Anup Singh for giving their presentations. And thank you all for joining us this afternoon in this discussion on the Quad Summit. The Society proposes to organize such discussions or webinars from time to time. The idea being that on issues of this nature, which directly relate to the basic objective of the society, namely the study of the Indian Ocean and this whole Quad or AUKUS or whatever, these are all now Indo-Pacific itself is related to the strategic as well as economic aspects of the Indian Ocean. So this is, I think these are the opportunities for the society which we propose to fully explore. And I would like to seek your cooperation in this regard. Once again, thanks a lot. And we will see in what fashion we can put today's discussion in social media, if at all we can do that. Thank you very much.